Welcome to the 2022 Spring Meetings Governor Talk Series. I'm Anne-Marie Gulde, Acting Director of the IMF's Asia Pacific Department. I'm very happy to talk to Governor Adrian Orr, Reserve Bank of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand today. Adrian Orr has been the Governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand since 2018, following an impressive career in New Zealand and abroad. It is with great pleasure to welcome you here, Governor, today for this installment of our Governor's Talk series. We are keenly interested to hear your thoughts on tracking inflation in uncertain times. The floor is yours, Governor.
Kia ora tātou, and welcome, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is a really great honour and privilege to be here talking about the challenges that we all face globally and how it's impacting here in New Zealand. Without doubt, central banks around the world are currently challenged by a very high and sustained inflationary pressures. The challenge is a familiar one, but I would say that the background and setting is unique. I mean, central banks now have to meet our low and stable inflation and contribute to employment mandates. We have to do that in the context of a large, evolving, severe health shock to the global economy, exacerbated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine at present. So it is an incredibly uncertain environment. The challenge in front of us is central banks, and I'm talking in general because we're all in this together at present, is really how do we tighten our monetary policies to constrain inflation expectations, but without creating a recession. So the challenge of a soft landing coming out over the next 2 years. For us, though, of course, we're considering this in this unusual environment. We have extremely volatile near-term data, so getting a starting point or a launching pad is very hard to estimate. There have been dramatic changes in the way people are behaving, either through regulated constraints or through natural human concern going on from the health shock. And there are an unbelievable number of continued economic shocks hitting the environment, whether they be health, geopolitical concerns, and of course, underlying this, the continued climate change challenge that we have. I would say that central banks aren't going to achieve their mandates on their own. Low and stable inflation and maximum sustainable employment, we are going to need support. Central banks are going to have to communicate very, very clearly about our purpose and why we are looking to lift interest rates in the current environment. We're going to have to be very clear with our fiscal authorities around what we're doing and how they could assist around more targeted, effective fiscal policies. And I would say, speaking to the global institutions here, we really do need to get on and make progress, work collaboratively on what I would call common issues or issues of the common. So it's a non-trivial challenge. The world has changed dramatically over the last 2 years, some ways in a permanent fashion, other ways in a temporary fashion. But the most obvious thing to us at the moment is the speed bumps that the global economy has run into and that globalization has hit. So, you know, this is the end of a big, beautiful globalization sprint, and we're now reflecting on what is a more optimal situation. Amongst this, I do have real concern around, you know, whenever you have a common problem, you have the likelihood of the tragedy of the commons entering policy making. And I believe that the tragedy of the commons can act to significantly inhibit progress on sustainable economic well-being. Some really simple and fresh examples, of course, are that the COVID vaccine should be available for all and be able to be available to all and taken by all. And that hasn't been the case. Likewise, the climate risk mitigation should be by all, for all, and all future generations. Again, that's been in large part pushed to the back, and if anything, being challenged by near-term economic crises. So in general terms, there's a massive infrastructure investment to be done globally. These need to be made to be investable opportunities, and public and private agents are going to have to be involved in building the infrastructure that's needed to transition into a more sustainable long-term economic environment. I know they're being thought about, these issues, very hard at institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, but I would challenge whether we are providing enough, I'd say, time budget towards long-term sustainable economic thinking relative to short-term macro stabilisation. And, you know, I will always challenge the IMF and other institutions to think hard around their role and whether they can be smarter as underwriters, as insurers, of enablers of the private sector investment into the significant challenge, infrastructure challenge that's needed. Back here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and more narrowly around our role at the Reserve Bank, what are we doing? Well, you know, we are in a tightening phase of monetary policy. New Zealand, it's a small open economy. We've been buffeted by exactly the same challenges as all IMF countries. We did have the advantage in New Zealand. We were able to stall the onset of the COVID-19 virus pandemic amongst the general public for quite some time, importantly until we were around 95% vaccinated across the population. So in terms of health, we've done very well, but it has come at the cost of having a closed border to international people movement, and that creates significant strain on resources that have been available. Our economy was in a strong position going into this COVID challenge. We had maximum sustainable employment. We had a very strong terms of trade, very healthy balance sheets, the financial sector, the government balance sheets. So we were in a robust position to manage the hit. Our initial monetary policy responses were very similar to most countries around the OECD, around the IMF world, and really what we did was act quickly, promoting cash flow and confidence throughout the economy, working strongly with the fiscal authorities on a range of mortgage deferrals and business guarantees. So we did all of that work, and importantly, we enabled the financial system to get on and do their job, which was to allocate capital and risk. I would say one of the great lessons, and I really hope we can bottle it and keep it and use it more often, was the immediate two-way flows of information that were happening between the public sector, the New Zealand Treasury, the Reserve Bank, and the private sector. We really needed that information to understand whether the policies we were doing were effective and how resilient businesses were being and the dynamics around credit and liquidity. So that information became real time, and very quickly, you know, we were monitoring, I suppose, over 100 real-time indices around people movement, travel movement, all anonymised, of course, but being able to see whether these policies were biting and we were targeting the right areas. Where are we now? Well, we are sitting where domestic demand has remained stronger than some of the dark predictions back at the beginning of 2020. We have continued good balance sheet strength in households and government. And fortunately, our terms of trade, our commodity export prices have held up well. So there's plenty of underlying economic momentum. But we have been caught, like many countries, around the fact that supply constraints have been pervasive and they have persisted longer than people thought. They're persisted not because of the same reason, but because of an ongoing continuous series of shocks. I've already mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So these high one-off relative prices hitting headline inflation on a persistent basis. Asset prices here in New Zealand also rose very, very strongly, as they did internationally, but in particular here in New Zealand it was house prices. So in that very extraordinarily low interest rate environment, people were looking for areas to put their surplus savings. Housing is an important part of an investment portfolio here in New Zealand, and this shift in demand occurred at a time when housing shortages were very prevalent in New Zealand. So the impact on house prices was dramatic, that was seen. Again, all similar shades of the same challenges that you see globally. What have we been doing? Well, we've been acting reasonably aggressively to tighten monetary conditions towards the second half of last year. During the second half of last year, we stopped our quantitative easing program, and we've since been lifting our official cash rate from its low of 0.25% to 1.5% as of yesterday to date. And we've also provided strong forward guidance that we expect to be doing more rate rises over coming quarters. So there is more work to do, and we're balancing that traditional risk. If you go too fast or too high, in fact, probably more related to too high, you really run the risk of having a sharper than needed slowdown in economic activity. On the other hand, if you go too slow, it's inflation expectations that will get away from us. And at the moment, the balance of risks, as far as the Monetary Policy Committee is concerned, is very much weighted to constraining those inflation expectations in the medium term to be within our target range. We know the long-term cost of letting inflation expectations getting away on you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much, Governor, for these really interesting remarks. Let us talk a little bit more about recent and prospective challenges. During COVID-19, during the pandemic, central bankers had to very quickly build an understanding of epidemiology and public health in order to make forecasts and policy decisions. How would the virus spread? How would healthcare systems cope? And what does it all mean for economic activity and inflation? As the leader of a major central bank, how did you and your team take on this unprecedented challenge?
Yes, you're correct. We all became aware of a whole new set of acronyms and health terms. So it was a real challenge. Just at the very high level, I would have to say, for monetary policy, the initial reactions were pretty straightforward. Clearly, this was going to be a large negative shock to both supply and demand, and it was likely that demand would be the first thing to impact. And so as literally the economy shut down, and so lower interest rates were the initial reaction. But, you know, I would have to say that we were very fortunate in New Zealand. I could say that we were, well planned. But here at the bank, we were in the midst and quite well advanced on preparing a much broader range of monetary policy and financial stability tools, really aimed at, bolstering the resilience of the financial system. We just completed work with our banks around increasing their capital requirements, capital buffers, liquidity, and a lot of work around risk awareness and I suppose bank conduct and culture. So it was very fresh in our minds around resilience. We're also talking openly and had developed a set of alternative or additional monetary policy tools because that was, reflecting the low nominal inflation and interest rate environment that we're in. So, because of the environment, we're at least well prepared. But once that pandemic was in full bloom, we had to work incredibly closely with industry and, of course, our fiscal authorities. We have a very strong and close relationship to understand what they were doing on the fiscal side and how we could support through both our prudential work but also our monetary policy work. And so monetary and fiscal policy became very close, which was a wonderful thing. We never felt like we had lost our independence, but we've certainly felt like we were part of a collective effort to this common goal of getting people through the health and economic challenges that we're on. That real-time share of data and flow of data, I think, was critical to understand how these new fiscal instruments could be implemented and whether they were being effective, and having enough humility to revisit and refine in real time as we were going through. So we didn't try to be health experts. We sat and obeyed and followed and by the experts, but we were thinking what can we do to make sure economic well-being, the economy, is maintained?
Thank you, Governor. Let's talk a bit more about inflation. In the context of a strong recovery that has coincided with rapid increase in inflation, real interest rates in many advanced economies are at historically low and very negative levels. Now the spike in commodity prices related to the Ukraine war will add to inflationary pressures. So my question to you, have central banks been caught on their back feet, and does all that put them in a catch-up mode?
Great question, and without doubt, monetary authorities have significant work ahead of them. That is always the case, but I would say in this instance, at least the direction is very clear. I always remember the words, if you're really struggling to think about what to do next, it's because you're probably in a good place now. For us, it's very obvious what we need to do next, which means we're not in a great place now. We need to tighten monetary conditions, and that's what we've been about. I say that, but with a bit of reflection. Our policy stance and the way we've been thinking about monetary policy here at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has been a least regrets framework. Back in 2020, we forget very quickly we were in an incredibly low and stable inflation environment, and we had, our biggest concern was deflation and effective zero bounds on nominal interest rates. So central banks, and us included, saw which regret would we most want to avoid, and deflation outweighed inflation. So central banks and ourselves were very comfortable and confident it was easier to risk over-egging than under-egging because deflation with zero-bound floors and so on is a nightmare to consider. So, I always thought, well, soon, at some point, we're going to have to be tightening policy if we are successful. So in a sense, I feel it's great that nominal interest rates are rising again, that we've got positive inflation, but all of these one-off additional shocks are exhausting. We have to get on and do stuff. So, the big lesson for us is we have to work very closely with the fiscal authorities to understand what they can do and can't do, and hence what we need to do in addition with monetary policy. And really, it's been the supply constraints and supply side of the economy that a lot of learning is well underway. Here for us, I think the main things we need to do is remove any remaining unnecessary monetary stimulus with that view, that focus on the domestic-driven part of our inflation. We have to retain an anti-inflation bias in everything we do. That is our role as central banks, to head off that headline inflation expectations becoming baked in to price setting. And, amongst all of this, the hardest part is we need to remain focused on the horizon over which we can be impactful, but without doing unnecessary damage to output and financial volatility. So it's a balancing act. It's about forward guidance, acting deliberately, and using very plain language to explain what we are about. We've started down that path. I've already mentioned the end of the quantitative easing, the lifting the official cash rates. Yesterday, we did a 50 basis point increase. That was more about doing it sooner rather than believing we have to do more. It's just getting on with it so that people can understand what we're about.
Thank you, Governor. I would like to turn to another point that you already mentioned in your introductory remarks, which is asset prices. So while expansionary monetary policy has helped central banks meet their price stability mandates during an extended period of weak demand, they also contributed to large and sustained increases in financial asset and especially real estate prices. This has raised understandable concerns about the lack of housing affordability in many advanced economies, including in New Zealand. So from the RBNZ's perspective, how do real estate prices factor into your policy decisions?
Yes, another great question, and one that without doubt has caused real serious thinking and a real challenge, as always, to the monetary authorities, not about what we have to do, but how we explain to people some of the implications and risks that can come from our actions. So, at the simplest level, our Monetary Policy Committee is focused on our remit, which is low and stable inflation and contributing to maximum sustainable employment. We do not have a house price target. However, we do think very hard around the role of asset prices, that in New Zealand, house prices are a big component of the total wealth in portfolio holdings. We think about the role of house prices as it can impact on inflation. The cost of being homed, for example, are some of the key components of the consumer price index. That's not the house price, it's just the cost of being homed. But likewise, the wealth effect, house prices go up, people feel wealthier, it impacts spending, it impacts investment, people will react to up and down shifts in their perceived wealth. So specifically, no house price target, but we need to be cognizant of the two-way relationship between monetary policy and interest rates and the asset prices. It is a two-way relationship, not one way. I say this, though, we do have in our monetary policy remit what I would call a please explain rather than please target request. And that please explain request is for the Monetary Policy Committee to talk to the issue of how is our decision today likely to impact or be consistent with the government's policy desire of having sustainable house prices. So in our monetary policy, we make our decisions based on our remit, but we will also talk to what we think, whether our shift in interest rates is going to see house prices trend towards a sustainable level or deviate from a sustainable level. I'm pleased to say at the moment, house prices were well above any measure of sustainable, and our actions have been bringing house prices back towards a sustainable level. So being able to talk about it in that way has been incredibly powerful. It has meant that we are now working very closely across a broad government sector. The door is open to say, hey, we are open to our economic analysis around these other long-term issues. To cut straight to the chase of our findings so far, collectively, the first one is blindingly obvious but impossible, so difficult to generate. A lack of housing supply will always mean that marginal shifts in demand have an outsized impact on prices. And New Zealand has had a housing shortage for a long time. So this very low nominal interest rate environment hit New Zealand at a time when housing was at a record shortage. The good news is that's changing rapidly. House building is now at record levels. There's housing supply coming onto the market at the same time that financial conditions and monetary conditions are tightening. So you are seeing that asset price, the house price, move back towards something more sustainable. But an ongoing challenge and opportunity for us more really is that we have really clarified what we mean by sustainable house prices, our role as a central bank, sustainable rather than affordable house prices, which is a whole different context. And we've been untangling the many different and complex drivers of house prices. There are renters, there are owner-occupiers, there's emergency housing, there is social housing. There are so many different drivers of demand for housing. And so with the central bank being in the middle, with our resources, our team's capability, we are working very close with other agencies to better think about these long-term effects and to better advise policy.
Thank you. This was a very interesting and comprehensive discussion, really interesting. Let me turn to my last question, which is on your balance sheet. So New Zealand has announced a program to reduce the size of the balance sheet by letting maturing bonds roll off and in addition selling a predetermined amount of bonds each year. By contrast, the Federal Reserve has halted its asset purchases, but so far not moved to reduce the size of its balance sheet, prioritizing the start of a rate hike cycle. Meanwhile, the Bank of England has started to reduce the size of its balance sheets by not rolling over its maturing gilts. Why did New Zealand decide on a faster pace of balance sheet reduction, and what role does this play in the process of monetary policy normalization?
Wonderful, and thank you again. I think the simple answers up front is I believe all central banks, have the same desired outcome, which is that quantitative easing has had its moment for now, touch wood. So at least these programs are stopping, and then they're being wound down in one of two ways: letting debt mature, or paying back that debt. And for us, we have chosen the latter. We don't see that as a major monetary policy signal at all, and we say that because the stopping of the quantitative easing was the main driver. By the time we stopped, our bond buying program was having a very, very marginal impact anyway on interest rates. The financial markets were liquid and stable, and the market participants themselves were saying, hey, we've got this, we're doing okay. So and that really reflects our initial thinking around quantitative easing. The big impact comes on the initial announcements and purchases of the bond programs. When they are most needed, you get the biggest bang for buck on longer term interest rates. But over time, the marginal change from additional buying has a very limited, if any, impact on longer term interest rates if your program is being successful. So, it had run its course. People were saying you could probably, you did a big splash when you arrived in the pool. Could you use the ladder when you exit? Could you just leave the market? The second part around our decision to just sell our holdings back to the New Zealand government, not back to the market, was that we wanted to ensure that we had fiscal headroom if we next needed to use these tools. So the government at the moment, through its own purposes of raising money, has a significant debt issuance program, like all governments do, and us putting these bonds back to this debt management office didn't really make much difference to them. So for us, it was about creating fiscal headroom for the future. For them, it was business as usual, and the markets have accepted that. So we've been very clear to the market: if you want to know what we think about monetary policy, watch the official cash rate, follow our forward guidance. Meanwhile, this balance sheet stuff is between friends, the Reserve Bank and the New Zealand Treasury.
Thank you, Governor Orr, for this very rich discussion and for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. From the IMF in Washington, I wish you all a very good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.